The silent struggle, every believer's war within. There is a battle that no believer escapes, a conflict that does not announce itself with noise or spectacle, yet shapes destinies more than any visible war. It is not fought with weapons, slogans, or public declarations. It unfolds quietly, often unnoticed by others, yet profoundly felt within the depths of the soul. This is the silent struggle, the war within every believer. It is the ongoing tension between what the spirit longs for and what the flesh demands. It is the unseen battleground where faith is refined, obedience is tested, and identity is forged. Many believers assume that once faith is awakened, peace automatically follows. They expect clarity, stability, and a life free from inner conflict. But the reality is far more complex. True faith does not eliminate struggle, it exposes it. The moment the spirit awakens, the flesh feels threatened. The inner war begins not because something is wrong, but because something eternal has been activated within a temporary vessel. This internal conflict is not a sign of failure. It is evidence of life. Only the spiritually dead feel no resistance. Only those who are asleep experience no tension. The believer, however, lives between two worlds. The body belongs to time, appetite, comfort, and survival. The spirit belongs to eternity, discipline, obedience, and truth. When these two realities collide within the same person, conflict is inevitable. What makes this struggle particularly difficult is its silence. There are no visible scars. No one applauds restraint. No one sees the moments when a believer chooses obedience over desire, silence over reaction, humility over pride. The most decisive battles are fought alone, in thoughts, intentions, and choices no one else witnesses. This is why many believers feel isolated in their struggle. They assume they are weak, broken, or spiritually flawed, when in truth they are engaged in the very war that defines authentic faith. The silent struggle shapes character more than public victories ever could. It determines whether a believer becomes disciplined or double-minded, anchored or unstable, surrendered or controlled by impulses. Every major breakthrough in the life of faith is preceded by an internal war. Before obedience becomes visible, it is first chosen in secret. Before transformation appears outwardly, it is forged inwardly through resistance. This series explores that hidden battlefield. It speaks to the believer who feels torn between conviction and desire, between calling and comfort, between surrender and self-preservation. It is for those who love God sincerely yet feel the constant pull of old patterns, emotional habits, and fleshly instincts. It is for those who wonder why spiritual growth feels so difficult even after years of belief. The war within is not meant to destroy the believer. It is meant to refine them. But only those who understand its nature can fight it wisely. Only those who recognize the enemy within can stop blaming the world outside. The silent struggle is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming aligned. And it begins with understanding the nature of the conflict itself. The origin of the inner war. Why the flesh resists the spirit. The inner war every believer experiences does not begin with external temptation. It begins with identity. The moment a person awakens spiritually, they discover that not everything within them agrees with the direction their spirit now desires to go. This discovery is often confusing and discouraging. Many believers ask themselves why, if they truly love God, they still feel resistance, distraction, and inner opposition. The answer lies in the fundamental nature of the flesh and its relationship to control. The flesh is not merely the physical body. It represents the entire system of instincts, habits, desires, emotional reactions, and survival patterns formed under a life driven by self-preservation rather than surrender. Long before the spirit awakens, the flesh learns how to rule. It learns what brings comfort, pleasure, validation, and security. Over time, it becomes efficient, automatic, and deeply entrenched. When the spirit awakens, it does not erase this system, it challenges it. This is why the flesh resists the spirit. The flesh is not neutral. It does not simply step aside when spiritual awareness emerges. It fights because it perceives loss. To the flesh, spiritual discipline feels like deprivation. Obedience feels like restriction. Silence feels like threat. The flesh does not measure life by truth or eternity, but by immediate satisfaction and emotional safety. When the spirit begins to lead, the flesh senses that its dominance is being questioned. This resistance often surprises believers. They expect that loving God should make obedience easy, but love does not automatically dismantle habits built over years. Desire does not instantly reprogram instincts. The inner war exists because two different leadership systems are operating within the same person. The spirit seeks alignment with eternal truth. The flesh seeks control over immediate experience. Both cannot lead at the same time. The flesh resists the spirit most fiercely when growth is near. Moments of spiritual breakthrough often trigger intense internal opposition. This is not coincidence. When the spirit begins to gain clarity, the flesh increases noise. When conviction deepens, distraction intensifies. When surrender becomes possible, fear suddenly becomes loud. The flesh understands something important. If it loses control now, it may never regain it in the same way. This explains why believers often struggle most when they are closest to transformation. The inner war intensifies not because the believer is failing, but because something within them is losing power. The flesh does not negotiate quietly. It uses familiar tools: doubt, fatigue, emotional reasoning, rationalization, and urgency. It whispers that obedience can wait, that discipline is extreme, that rest means indulgence, and that restraint is unnecessary. One of the most subtle strategies of the flesh is imitation. It learns spiritual language without surrendering control. It can agree with truth intellectually while resisting it practically. A believer may understand what is right, yet feel unable to live it consistently. This creates internal frustration and shame. But this frustration is not proof of hypocrisy. It is proof of conflict. The inner war is also fueled by memory. The flesh remembers what once worked. It remembers how certain behaviors numbed pain, provided escape, or offered pleasure. When the spirit calls for change, the flesh responds by reminding the believer of comfort. It does not argue with theology. It appeals to emotion. This is why spiritual battles are often emotional before they are rational. Another reason the flesh resists the spirit is fear of exposure. The spirit brings light. Light reveals motives, intentions, and hidden attachments. The flesh prefers darkness, not because it is evil by nature, but because darkness allows control without accountability. When the spirit leads, excuses collapse. Self-deception becomes harder to maintain. The flesh resists not just loss of pleasure, but loss of narrative control. This war is not resolved through willpower alone. Trying to dominate the flesh through sheer force often backfires. The flesh is resilient because it is reactive. The more aggressively it is attacked without understanding, the more it adapts. True victory begins with awareness. The believer must recognize that the inner war is structural, not personal. It is not about being a bad believer. It is about living in a divided condition that requires intentional alignment. Understanding the origin of this war removes unnecessary guilt. It shifts the believer from self-condemnation to strategy. The flesh resists because it has ruled for a long time. The spirit must learn to lead patiently, consistently, and decisively. Growth is not the absence of resistance, but the ability to choose direction despite it. The inner war is not meant to be silenced by denial. It must be engaged with clarity. When believers stop fearing the conflict and start understanding it, the struggle loses some of its power. The flesh thrives on confusion. The spirit grows through truth. This first stage of the silent struggle is recognition, recognizing that resistance does not mean rejection by God, but invitation into maturity, recognizing that discomfort often precedes alignment, recognizing that the war within is not proof of weakness, but evidence that the spirit is alive and calling for leadership. And this is only the beginning. If this message resonates with you and you want to continue exploring how to overcome the inner war every believer faces, subscribe to the channel and stay connected for the next part of this journey. The voice of the flesh. How inner dialogue shapes the battle. The war within every believer does not begin with actions. It begins with voices, not audible voices, but internal dialogue. The constant stream of thoughts, interpretations, justifications, memories, and emotional reactions that shape perception before behavior ever manifests. Many believers underestimate this inner dialogue, assuming the real struggle is external temptation or visible sin. In reality, the most decisive battles are fought silently in the mind, long before the body ever moves. The flesh rarely commands directly. It persuades, it reasons, it negotiates. It does not usually say, "Reject the spirit." Instead, it says, "Not now. Later. You deserve rest. This is too much. Or God understands." These thoughts sound harmless, even reasonable. That is precisely why they are effective. The flesh does not rely on rebellion alone. It relies on familiarity and emotional logic. Inner dialogue becomes the meeting place where spirit and flesh collide. The spirit speaks in terms of truth, alignment, obedience, and long-term purpose. Its voice is often calm, steady, and firm, but not loud. The flesh, on the other hand, speaks with urgency. It amplifies emotion. It frames situations through comfort, fear, and immediate relief. Because humans are wired to respond quickly to emotion, the flesh often appears louder even when it is weaker. One of the most dangerous misconceptions believers carry is the idea that temptation is external. While external triggers exist, the real power lies in interpretation. Two believers can face the same situation, yet experience entirely different inner battles depending on how their internal dialogue responds. The flesh interprets events in a way that reinforces control. The spirit interprets them in a way that invites surrender. The flesh is highly skilled at storytelling. It builds narratives that justify resistance. It reminds the believer of past failures to discourage present obedience. It magnifies exhaustion to excuse compromise. It reframes discipline as punishment and indulgence as self-care. Over time, these stories become automatic. The believer may not even realize they are agreeing with them. This agreement is where the battle is often lost quietly and gradually. Inner dialogue shapes identity. What a believer consistently tells themselves eventually becomes how they see themselves. If the flesh dominates the narrative, the believer begins to identify as weak, inconsistent, or incapable of change. This identity then reinforces behavior. The flesh does not need to overpower the spirit physically. It only needs to convince the believer that resistance is futile. The spirit, however, speaks differently. It does not flatter, it does not rush. It does not manipulate through fear or comfort. The spirit speaks in alignment with truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. It calls the believer higher, not through pressure, but through clarity. Yet because its voice is quieter, it requires attentiveness. Many believers lose battles not because the spirit is absent, but because they are not listening. Silence plays a critical role in this war. The flesh thrives on noise, constant stimulation, distraction, emotional reaction. Noise prevents reflection. It keeps the believer from noticing patterns in thought. When silence enters, the inner dialogue becomes visible. This is why many believers avoid stillness. In silence, they confront the voices they have been agreeing with unconsciously. The flesh resists silence because silence exposes motive. Without distraction, the believer becomes aware of the subtle negotiations happening internally. They begin to see how often they delay obedience, rationalize disobedience, or soften conviction. This awareness can be uncomfortable, but it is essential. You cannot challenge a voice you have never identified. Another strategy of the flesh is impersonation. It learns to quote spiritual language without embodying spiritual direction. A believer may hear thoughts that sound wise, patient, or compassionate, but subtly redirect away from obedience. Discernment becomes crucial here. Not every calm thought is spiritual. Not every comforting idea aligns with truth. The flesh is capable of producing peace that avoids growth rather than producing peace that follows surrender. The inner dialogue also determines emotional regulation. When the flesh leads, emotions dictate decisions. A believer may feel unmotivated and assume they should wait. They may feel anxious and assume avoidance is wisdom. The Spirit, however, does not wait for emotion to align before acting. It acts from conviction, allowing emotion to follow rather than lead. Many believers confuse emotional relief with spiritual peace. The flesh seeks relief, escape from discomfort, tension, or discipline. The Spirit seeks peace, alignment with truth regardless of discomfort. Relief is immediate but temporary. Peace is stable, but often requires endurance. The inner dialogue determines which one the believer pursues. The longer a believer allows the flesh to narrate their internal experience, the harder it becomes to recognize the Spirit's voice. This does not happen suddenly. It happens through repetition. Repeated thoughts become beliefs. Repeated beliefs become identity. Identity then governs behavior automatically. This is why the inner war feels so entrenched for many believers. They are not only fighting temptation, they are fighting habits of thought. Transformation begins when the believer stops passively listening and starts actively discerning. This does not mean suppressing thoughts, but examining them. Where does this thought lead? Does it move toward obedience or delay it? Does it align with truth or comfort? Does it require courage or avoidance? These questions weaken the flesh's influence by exposing its patterns. The Spirit gains strength through agreement. Each time the believer chooses to align with truth internally, even without immediate action, the balance shifts. The inner war is not won in a single moment of heroism. It is won through countless small decisions to listen differently, interpret differently, and respond differently. The flesh loses power when its narratives are no longer accepted without question. The Spirit grows when its voice is trusted, even when it challenges. Over time, the internal dialogue changes. What once felt loud becomes quieter. What once felt demanding becomes less persuasive. The war does not disappear, but leadership becomes clearer. This is why discipline of thought is foundational to spiritual maturity. A believer who does not guard their inner dialogue will constantly feel defeated without understanding why. External behavior will always follow internal agreement. The battlefield is not the moment of action, it is the moment of interpretation. The silent struggle intensifies or weakens based on which voice the believer consistently honors. Every thought entertained is a vote. Every narrative accepted shapes direction. The flesh does not need total control. It only needs enough influence to delay alignment. The Spirit does not need perfection. It needs permission to lead. As this internal dialogue becomes clearer, the believer begins to recognize that the war within is not chaotic. It follows patterns, and patterns can be interrupted. If this message is helping you recognize the silent dynamics shaping your inner battle, and you want to continue learning how to walk in clarity and strength, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us. Discipline as warfare, why consistency weakens the flesh over time. The inner war every believer faces is not won through intensity alone. Moments of emotional resolve, spiritual excitement, or sudden conviction may spark change, but they are not what sustain it. The flesh is patient. It knows how to wait for emotions to cool, for motivation to fade, and for routines to return to what is familiar. This is why discipline, not inspiration, becomes one of the most powerful weapons in the silent struggle. Discipline is not punishment. It is warfare. It is the slow, deliberate dismantling of the flesh's influence through consistent alignment with the spirit. Many believers misunderstand discipline because they associate it with rigidity, harshness, or legalism. But spiritual discipline is not about restriction for its own sake. It is about reordering authority within the believer. Every disciplined action is a declaration. The Spirit leads here, not impulse. Over time, these declarations accumulate. They reshape internal power dynamics. The flesh does not lose influence because it is argued against. It loses influence because it is consistently bypassed. The flesh thrives on inconsistency. It does not need to dominate every decision. It only needs enough unpredictability to regain control. A believer who obeys sporadically but yields frequently remains internally unstable. Discipline removes that instability. It creates predictability, not for the flesh but against it. When obedience becomes routine, the flesh loses its leverage of surprise. This is why the flesh resists discipline so fiercely. Discipline removes negotiation. It eliminates the daily debate that exhausts the believer. Instead of asking, "Do I feel like obeying today?" discipline answers in advance, "This is already decided." The flesh depends on open questions. Discipline closes them. That closure feels threatening because it limits the flesh's ability to influence outcomes through emotion. Discipline also exposes how much of the inner struggle is not spiritual confusion, but habit. Many believers believe they are struggling because God is silent, when in reality, they are struggling because their routines still serve old leadership. The flesh is reinforced by repetition. So is the spirit. Whichever one is practiced more consistently gains authority. Consistency is particularly powerful because it works even when feelings do not cooperate. The flesh often argues that obedience should feel natural if it is truly spiritual. But growth rarely feels natural at first. The body and mind are accustomed to certain rhythms. When those rhythms change, resistance is expected. Discipline does not wait for comfort. It proceeds despite discomfort, trusting that alignment produces peace later. One of the most important shifts a believer can make is redefining what success looks like in the inner war. Success is not the absence of temptation. It is the presence of follow-through. The flesh may still suggest alternatives, distractions, or shortcuts, but discipline responds with action, not debate. Each time the believer follows through, even imperfectly, the flesh's credibility weakens. Discipline also re-educates desire. Desire is not fixed, it is trained. What the believer repeatedly chooses becomes what the believer eventually prefers. At first, discipline feels forced because desire has not yet caught up with conviction. Over time, as the Spirit's choices become familiar, desire begins to shift. What once felt difficult becomes normal. What once felt appealing loses its grip. The flesh fears this process because it understands something critical. Once discipline rewires desire, its influence is dramatically reduced. The flesh thrives when desire aligns with impulse. Discipline interrupts that alignment. It creates space for the spirit to redefine what satisfaction means. Another overlooked aspect of discipline is that it builds trust between the believer and their own spirit. Many believers struggle with self-doubt because they have a history of inconsistency. They want to trust themselves spiritually, but cannot because past intentions were not followed through. Discipline rebuilds that trust slowly. Each kept commitment strengthens internal integrity. Over time, the believer becomes more confident in their ability to obey, which further weakens the flesh's intimidation tactics. The flesh often uses exhaustion as a weapon against discipline. It frames consistency as unsustainable, extreme, or unrealistic. It argues that rest requires indulgence and that boundaries are oppressive. But true discipline includes wisdom. It does not demand perfection, it demands faithfulness. It does not deny rest. It defines it differently. Rest under the Spirit restores alignment. Rest under the flesh numbs conviction. Consistency also removes drama from spirituality. The flesh enjoys emotional extremes, guilt followed by relief, resolve followed by collapse. Discipline flattens those cycles. It replaces them with steady progress. This can feel less exciting, which is why some believers unconsciously resist it. But spiritual maturity is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, stable, and deeply rooted. One of the reasons discipline feels lonely is because it is rarely visible. Others may not see the choices a believer makes daily to align with truth. There is no applause for restraint, no recognition for unseen obedience. The flesh uses this invisibility to argue that discipline is unnecessary. But the Spirit understands that what is built in secret shapes what endures in public. Discipline also strengthens discernment. When routines are aligned, it becomes easier to recognize when something is off. The believer becomes more sensitive to subtle shifts in motivation and intention. The flesh prefers confusion. Discipline produces clarity. With clarity comes quicker correction. Instead of spiraling, the believer adjusts. It is important to understand that discipline does not eliminate grace. It partners with it. Grace empowers discipline by removing condemnation. Discipline honors grace by refusing to treat forgiveness as permission to drift. Together, they create a structure where growth can occur without shame. The inner war often feels endless because believers look for a final victory rather than sustainable leadership. Discipline does not promise an end to resistance. It promises progress in authority. The flesh may still speak, but it speaks from a weaker position. Its suggestions carry less urgency. Its arguments feel less convincing. Over time, the believer notices that obedience requires less effort because alignment has become familiar. This does not happen overnight. The flesh is resilient. It adapts. It waits. But discipline outlasts it. Consistency does what emotion cannot. It trains the believer's entire system, mind, body, and habit, to follow the Spirit, even when the path feels narrow. Ultimately, discipline is an act of trust. Trust that alignment is worth the effort. Trust that obedience produces freedom rather than loss. Trust that the Spirit knows where it is leading, even when the flesh insists otherwise. Each disciplined choice is a declaration of allegiance. The silent struggle begins to shift when discipline becomes normal rather than exceptional, when obedience is no longer a heroic act, but a practiced response, when consistency replaces negotiation. At that point, the war within does not disappear, but it becomes manageable. Leadership becomes clearer. Direction becomes steadier. And this steady leadership prepares the believer for the deeper layers of the battle still ahead. If this teaching is helping you understand how discipline reshapes the inner war and you want to continue growing in strength and clarity, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us. Isolation, loneliness, and the inner war. Why the battle intensifies in silence. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the inner war is its relationship with isolation. Many believers assume that loneliness is a sign of spiritual failure, abandonment, or weakness. They interpret seasons of isolation as punishment or loss. In reality, isolation is often not a consequence of the inner war, but a condition in which the war becomes visible. Silence strips away distractions. Loneliness removes external validation. What remains is the unfiltered confrontation between flesh and spirit. The flesh fears isolation more than it fears discipline. Distractions are its greatest ally. Noise, constant interaction, entertainment, and external stimulation keep the inner war blurred. When these are removed, the believer begins to hear their own thoughts clearly. The internal dialogue becomes unavoidable. This is why the flesh works relentlessly to keep the believer surrounded by noise, opinions, and emotional engagement. Isolation threatens its camouflage. Isolation exposes dependency. Many believers discover in solitude how much of their sense of peace depended on others' presence, approval, or affirmation. The flesh thrives on external regulation. It prefers its comfort reinforced by relationships, routines, and familiar environments. When these are stripped away, the flesh loses its stabilizers and becomes reactive. The spirit, however, grows stronger in this environment because it does not rely on external reinforcement. It draws stability from alignment rather than validation. This is why the inner war often intensifies during seasons of loneliness. The believer is not suddenly weaker, they are suddenly aware. Without constant stimulation, unresolved patterns surface. Old habits attempt to reassert control. Emotional wounds speak louder. The flesh uses isolation to argue that obedience has led to loss, that faith has cost too much, and that surrender has isolated the believer unnecessarily. These thoughts can feel convincing because they are accompanied by real emotional pain. But isolation is not abandonment. It is exposure. It reveals what has been managing the believer's inner life beneath the surface. In solitude, the believer learns whether their peace comes from alignment or distraction. The flesh resists this discovery fiercely because it threatens its illusion of necessity. If the believer learns to remain steady without constant stimulation, the flesh loses one of its most effective tools. Loneliness also tests identity. When no one is watching, affirming, or responding, the believer confronts the question of who they are without feedback. The flesh prefers identity that is mirrored externally. The spirit prefers identity rooted internally. This tension becomes sharp in isolation. The believer may feel invisible, unimportant, or forgotten. The flesh interprets this as proof of insignificance. The spirit interprets it as an invitation to deepen dependence on truth rather than perception. Another reason isolation intensifies the inner war is because it disrupts emotional regulation. Many people regulate their emotions through interaction. Conversation distracts pain. Activity numbs anxiety. Social engagement provides reassurance. When these are removed, emotions surface without filters. The flesh panics in this environment because it no longer has quick relief options. It responds with urgency, restlessness, and craving. The spirit responds with stillness, endurance, and clarity. This contrast often makes isolation feel unbearable at first. The believer may experience heightened temptation, emotional swings, or intrusive thoughts. They may question their faith more intensely than before, but this does not mean isolation is harming them. It means the inner war is no longer diluted. The battlefield has narrowed. The conflict is now concentrated rather than scattered. Isolation also reveals attachments. The believer begins to see what they reach for when comfort is absent. What habits resurface? What thoughts dominate? What desires become loud? These are not random. They reveal where the flesh has been drawing strength. The Spirit uses this revelation to invite intentional realignment. Without isolation, these attachments often remain hidden beneath busyness. The flesh frequently frames isolation as failure. It tells the believer that they are alone because they are flawed, unlovable, or misguided. This narrative is powerful because it aligns with emotional pain, but it is false. Many of the deepest transformations in spiritual history occurred in isolation, not because isolation was the goal, but because it removed interference. Growth requires focus. Focus requires silence. Silence often feels like loneliness, before it feels like clarity. Isolation also weakens performative faith. When no one is watching, spiritual practices lose external reward. The believer must confront whether their obedience is rooted in conviction or recognition. The flesh thrives on performance. It enjoys appearing spiritual more than being aligned. Isolation removes the audience. This makes obedience feel heavier at first, but purer over time. The Spirit uses isolation to retrain attention. Without constant external input, the believer becomes more aware of subtle shifts in thought, emotion, and motivation. This awareness sharpens discernment. The flesh prefers confusion and overwhelm. The Spirit prefers clarity and simplicity. Isolation moves the believer toward the latter, though the transition can feel disorienting. Another layer of the inner war revealed in isolation is fear of permanence. The flesh often whispers that loneliness will never end, that this season is final. This fear creates urgency and desperation. The Spirit, however, does not operate on panic. It understands seasons. It understands timing. Isolation teaches the believer to endure without rushing toward relief. This endurance builds resilience that cannot be learned in comfort. Isolation also forces the believer to confront unresolved grief. Without distraction, losses resurface. Disappointments regain weight. The flesh seeks immediate escape from this discomfort. The Spirit invites processing rather than avoidance. This processing is painful but necessary. What is not faced becomes fuel for future resistance. Over time, something begins to shift. The noise quiets. The urgency fades. The believer discovers that they can remain present without constant stimulation. Loneliness slowly transforms into solitude. Solitude is not the absence of people. It is the presence of self-awareness without panic. At this point, the flesh loses ground. Its arguments feel repetitive. Its urgency feels exaggerated. The Spirit gains steadiness. Isolation does not eliminate the inner war, but it clarifies it. It removes false enemies and exposes the real one. The believer realizes that many struggles they attributed to circumstances were actually internal negotiations. With fewer external variables, responsibility becomes clearer. This clarity empowers intentional change. Eventually, the believer understands that isolation was not meant to define them, but refine them. It was not meant to replace community, but prepare them for healthier connection. When the inner war is faced in solitude, relationships become less about regulation and more about contribution. The believer no longer needs others to manage their inner state. The flesh loses power when the believer learns they can survive silence. The Spirit gains authority when the believer learns to remain aligned without applause, distraction, or reassurance. This authority carries forward into every environment. The silent struggle reaches a deeper stage here. The believer no longer fights only temptation, thoughts, or habits. They fight dependency itself. And as dependency weakens, freedom becomes possible. If this message is speaking to the season you are in and helping you understand why isolation has intensified your inner battle, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us as we move toward the final stage of this inner war. Surrender and authority. How the inner war ends in alignment, not control. The final stage of the inner war is often misunderstood because it does not look like victory in the way the flesh expects it to. Many believers imagine that winning the war within means eliminating struggle entirely, silencing temptation forever, or reaching a state where obedience feels effortless at all times. But the inner war does not end through domination of the self. It ends through surrender. Not surrender to weakness, but surrender to rightful authority. The war within ends not when the flesh is destroyed, but when it is no longer in charge. At the deepest level, the inner conflict has always been about leadership. The flesh wants control. The Spirit seeks alignment. Control demands constant effort. constant vigilance, constant defense. Alignment produces authority. Authority does not shout. It does not argue endlessly. It operates from position, not panic. When the believer finally understands this distinction, the nature of the struggle changes fundamentally. The flesh fears surrender because surrender feels like loss. It equates authority with autonomy and obedience with erasure. But this fear is built on a false assumption that the self must remain sovereign to survive. In truth, the flesh does not lose identity through surrender, it loses tyranny. The believer does not disappear when the Spirit leads. They become integrated. The fragmentation that fueled the inner war begins to dissolve. Surrender is often resisted because it feels passive, but true surrender is one of the most active decisions a believer can make. It is the deliberate release of the need to manage outcomes internally. It is the refusal to negotiate constantly with impulse, fear, and self-protection. Surrender says, "I will no longer argue for my limitations." This is not weakness. This is clarity. One of the most exhausting aspects of the inner war is the constant internal management the flesh demands. It wants reassurance, control over timing, guarantees of comfort, and explanations for every sacrifice. Surrender interrupts this cycle. It removes the burden of self-justification. The believer stops needing to convince themselves why obedience is worth it and simply acts from trust. Authority emerges naturally from surrender. This seems paradoxical, but it is deeply consistent. Authority is not the ability to force compliance. It is the ability to move without resistance. When the believer stops fighting for control internally, their actions become more decisive externally. Hesitation fades. Fragmentation resolves. The Spirit no longer competes for attention. It leads. This is why surrender feels threatening at first. The flesh interprets the loss of internal debate as loss of safety. It fears being overruled without recourse. But what actually happens is the opposite. The believer experiences a new kind of stability. Decisions become simpler. The noise quiets. Energy that was once consumed by internal conflict becomes available for presence, creativity, and service. Surrender also redefines obedience. Obedience is no longer reactive or forced. It becomes relational. The believer stops obeying to avoid guilt and starts obeying from alignment. This shift is subtle but profound. Guilt-driven obedience exhausts the soul. Alignment-driven obedience strengthens it. The flesh thrives on guilt because guilt keeps the believer focused inward. Alignment redirects focus outward toward purpose. Another critical transformation that occurs through surrender is the collapse of false urgency. The flesh operates through urgency. It insists that everything must be resolved immediately, that discomfort is intolerable, that waiting is dangerous. Surrender removes this urgency. The believer learns to act deliberately rather than reactively. This does not slow progress, it stabilizes it. As surrender deepens, the believer begins to notice that the inner war no longer defines their identity. It becomes an experience rather than a prison. Thoughts still arise, desires still surface, but they no longer carry the same authority. The believer observes them without being compelled by them. This distance is not detachment from life, it is detachment from domination. The flesh loses its grip when it realizes it no longer sets the agenda. It may still suggest, but it no longer decides. This is the essence of spiritual authority. Authority does not require silence from opposition. It requires clarity of command. The Spirit does not eliminate the flesh's voice. It outranks it. Surrender also heals the believer's relationship with effort. Effort is no longer spent resisting oneself. It is spent embodying alignment. This is why mature believers often appear calm even under pressure. Their energy is not divided. They are not fighting themselves while facing the world. The inner war has been reordered. Importantly, surrender does not make the believer passive or disengaged. It makes them responsive rather than reactive. They become capable of acting without being driven by fear, pride, or appetite. This responsiveness creates wisdom. The believer no longer needs to prove strength through resistance. Strength is demonstrated through steadiness. One of the clearest signs that surrender has taken root is the disappearance of self-condemnation. The believer no longer interprets struggle as failure. When resistance appears, it is met with awareness rather than shame. Shame was one of the flesh's strongest weapons. It kept the believer oscillating between effort and collapse. Surrender dissolves shame by grounding identity in alignment rather than performance. Surrender also restores trust, not just trust in God, but trust in the process of transformation. The believer no longer rushes growth or despairs at slowness. They understand that alignment unfolds through consistency, patience, and truth. This trust creates emotional resilience. Setbacks no longer trigger collapse. Progress is measured over time, not moments. As authority stabilizes internally, external life begins to reflect it. Relationships become less charged. Boundaries become clearer. Decisions become firmer. The believer no longer needs constant affirmation because their center is stable. This does not make them distant. It makes them present without dependency. The inner war at this stage has fulfilled its purpose. It revealed false leadership. It exposed dependency. It trained discernment. It refined discipline. And finally, it invited surrender. The war does not end in annihilation, but in order. The flesh finds its proper place. The spirit leads without resistance. This alignment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It feels almost ordinary. But this ordinariness is its power. The believer wakes, acts, chooses, and responds from clarity rather than chaos. The silence that once felt threatening becomes grounding. The struggle that once felt overwhelming becomes instructive rather than consuming. The silent struggle does not disappear completely, but it no longer defines the believer's life. It becomes background rather than center. The believer understands that growth is not about erasing humanity, but about ordering it under truth. This is the end of the war as a crisis, and the beginning of authority as a way of life. If this series has helped you understand the silent struggle within and how surrender leads to true spiritual authority, subscribe to the channel and continue walking this path of alignment, clarity, and inner strength with us.